Right, so there's that whole how do you knit thing on Ravelry. So I thought I'd show how I knit. I knit Continental, but I also knit Combined. So these are Western-oriented stitches. The right-hand leg of the stitch is in front of the needle, the left-hand leg of the stitch is behind. These are standard Western-oriented and very easy to work. And then that doesn't look any different to anybody who works Western normally. Oh, a little bit of rowing out there. But I work my purls Eastern. So a normal continental purl involves bringing the yarn this way. If you look at the stitch, the right-hand leg of the stitch is in front of the needle, and the left-hand leg of the stitch is behind, just like the knits were. But I knit like this, or rather purl, and that places the right-hand leg of the stitch behind the needle and the left-hand leg of the stitch in front. I like it. I think it's fast, it's easy, and I have better control of my tension. Speaking of which, I should probably show how I tension my yarn. Anyway, this means on the return that all of my stitches, I like to slip the first, all of my stitches are oriented backwards for what a Western knitter is used to. That just means approaching the stitch differently. If you've ever worked a slip-slip knit, where you slip a stitch knitwise and then slip another one knitwise and then put them back on the needle, or just work them together as a decrease, you're used to working the stitches in that direction. Oh, and look, here's that first one I did. Continental Western. Alright. So there's that. Now, there are people who say you can't work something like ribbing, no, not ribbing, seat stitch combined. I say, what the heck? Of course you can do seat stitch combined. You can do anything combined. In some cases you might need to reorient a stitch or two, but most of those situations can be solved by how you approach the stitch. For example, if I were to do ribbing, I would purl on top of this purl, and I would be used to purling that way, approaching a stitch that is Western oriented and just purling it like normal. And when I got to the knit stitch next to it, I would be used to, if I was working flat, stockinette, I would be used to knitting through the back of the loop, as people call it, because it's behind the needle. I don't like that. I don't like that naming system, but the leading edge, the right hand leg of the stitch, bringing it through like that. That's what I'm used to, working stockinette flat. But if I want to do seat stitch, my purls are oriented backwards from what I would consider typical for knitting into a stitch. That ain't so. All it is that the purl stitches, because they were knit on the previous other side, are oriented like a Western stitch, and the knits are oriented like a Eastern stitch. That just means I approach the stitch differently. This just means I put my needle, my right hand needle, into the stitch differently. If I'm knitting it, I do it this way. If I'm purling it, I do it this way. The whole point of this is to keep this right hand leg of the stitch to the right. If it's ever to the left, the stitch crosses. The legs are not open, and that changes the character of the worked stitch. The fabric will be different. Sometimes it'll bias a little bit. So instead of working this way, it's the back of the loop, which people who work combined get used to when working stockinette flat. Work through the front. And ditto, instead of working through the front and purling that way and getting a cross stitch, I purl through the back. Okay? That's anything that requires working over a stitch oriented differently than expected. This means that ribbing in the round would be worked the same way. So again, seat stitch. Always keeping the right hand leg of the stitch to the right. It doesn't matter how you approach the stitch, as long as the right hand leg, and there's two stitches of ribbing, doesn't matter, as long as the right hand leg is to the right. I do it automatically, and I do it by feel. So 2 stitches of ribbing, and then more seat stitch. Alright? You can see how the stitches are oriented differently on the needle. They angle a little bit. Let's seat stitch. One last thing, how I tension my yarn, because that seems to fascinate people. This is how I hold my yarn. Sometimes I hold it under all of them. I have very loose tension normally. I've always been a loose knitter, except when I work on very tiny needles. I apply tension by closing and opening my hand against the needle and pinching the yarn essentially between my fingers. That's it. No weird, see here, no weird wrapping it around. It doesn't go around a finger at all. I never do any of that. See? It's entirely pulling like this between my fingers. And my finger stays down by the needle. Unless I happen to have a lot of excess yarn and I'm trying to tension a little harder, and then I'll pull it up. But I prefer not to. I like a very soft tension. That is how I knit.